and gentlemen, welcome to this week's episode in Focus. The Korea-US FTA has been stalling for more than 3 years since its signing. Now it appears we can get a move on with a long overdue rectification of the deal, as the major issues of contention were renegotiated by the trade ministers of both countries. Let's examine the terms of compromise reached and their implications after the newsreel.
Korea and the United States made a set of additional agreements to the Korea-US FTA, the ratification of which has been stalling since its signing in June 2007. Through this new agreement, the U.S. and Korea were able to gain additional concessions in contentious sectors such as automobiles and agriculture. On automobiles, Korea agreed to allow the U.S. to continue its 2.5% tariff on imports for 4 years after the effectuation of the FTA, while Korean tariffs will be halved to 4% immediately and eliminated on the 5th year. In exchange, the U.S. agreed to Korea keeping its tariff on pork for 5 years. The controversial issue of U.S. beef imports was not discussed. The additional agreement is expected to be signed within the coming weeks and will be passed to the legislative bodies of both countries for ratification. With the leaders of both countries evaluating the recent agreement as a win-win deal, the KORUS FTA is expected to be ratified within the next year to take effect in the beginning of 2012.
Welcome back. We have two expert guests in the studio today. Allow me to Professor Lee Do-won, who is Professor and Chair, School of Economics at Yonsei University. Thanks for being with us today, Professor Lee.
Good to be here.
Yes, on my left is Dr. Song Won-gun, who is Director of Division of Finance and Physical Policies at Korea Economic Research Institute. Well, welcome back on our program, Dr. Song.
Nice to be here.
Well, the additional round of the negotiations for Korea-USA FTA just completed. So I think it's quite unusual because after both involved countries sign on the FTA, there is no more the modifications. But this FTA actually had the additional round of negotiations, so quite exceptional, I think. So I want to discuss about why this additional round of negotiations had to take place. Could you, Professor Lee?
Sure. I think we'd better review the brief history of the Korea-US FTA in order to answer the questions. As you know, the first version of the Korea-US FTA was agreed in 2007 under the previous regime of Roh Moo-hyun between Korea and the U.S. And then we had a regime change in Korea in the early 2008. Right after the regime change, we had a massive street demonstration in Korea, which was opposing the Korea-US FTA due to the issue of the beef import from the U.S. to Korea. And as we recall, that street rallies has simply frozen almost all the government activities in South Korea, at least for a couple of months. At the same time, we also had an opposition voice from the U.S. side as well. From the presidential campaign period, the President Barack Obama, at that time the president candidate, opposed the contents of the Korea-US FTA, saying that it was unfair to the U.S., especially to the U.S. auto industry. So in both sides of Korea and the U.S., the effort to ratify and the effort to push forward the Korea-US FTA was fairly limited and timid in the beginning of 2008. And that continued until 2009. So we can say that by the end of 2008, or at least by the first half of the 2010, the voices to support Korea-US FTA, both in Korea and the U.S., were very small. And then we tried to reach a final conclusion during the G20 summit that was held in November this year between the President Lee Myung-bak and President Barack Obama. And we expected something fairly dramatic to happen, but they failed to reach an agreement as well. So that's why we had to do this additional negotiation in December 2010. As you mentioned, it was a fairly unusual thing, but I think, as we look back these histories, it was kind of necessary and inevitable.
I see. Well, by the way, actually there were three major industries in which the additional concessions were made at the additional round of negotiations: automobile industry, pork, and the pharmaceutical industries. Well, actually, what kind of discussions they made at this additional round of negotiations?
Yeah, the first one is the first one, and the most important one is the auto industry.
I see.
The major change is on the tariff elimination schedule for both countries. For example, a tariff elimination schedule for U.S. on imported Korean autos will be extended to 4 years, I think. In the original version, the 2007 version, would have eliminated the tariff right away on 90% of Korean autos, but and on larger autos, tariff would be phased out over 3 years. But in this additional negotiation, they have reached that tariff elimination schedule for U.S. on imported Korean autos would be extended over 4 years.
4 years, yes.
And then, and Korea will lower its 8% tariff on U.S. imported U.S. autos to 4% immediately, and eliminate it completely over 5 years later. So it seemed balanced. Okay, 5 years of tariff elimination schedule. And then second one is the safety and environmental regulations on imported U.S. cars. U.S. car makers will be mostly exempted from safety and environmental regulations in Korea. And then the other thing is the tariff elimination schedule for trucks imported to U.S. The tariff of the trucks is 25%, and then in the original version, it will be phased out over 10 years, gradually. But in this case, it is being remained for 8 years as 25%, and then eliminated it in the 10th year. So, 10 years. This 10 years is the same, but the period is the same, but for 8 years, it will be remained as the 25%. So it will be, it will protect the truck market in the U.S. And then, and the other thing the important thing for the auto industry is that the specific safeguard to the auto industry safeguard is introduced in this new agreement. So if there were a sudden surge in auto imports as a consequence of the FTA, so the tariff will be reimposed, can be reimposed. The second industry is the pork industry. Okay, the tariff on imported U.S. pork will be phased out in 2014. 2014 in the original version, but in this new agreement, it will be postponed until 2016. 2 years.
2 years more,
right? 2 years more. And then the last one is the pharmaceutical industry. There is a provision in the original version that to link the marketing permission of a new pharmaceutical product and the patent rights. So if you want to promote the new pharmaceutical product, you have to get permission from the patent.
I see.
Patentee. So, but in the original version, it is supposed to be effective 18 months after the FTA is in force, but in the new agreement, it is changed to be effective 3 years after the FTA is in force. So these additional agreements for pork and pharmaceutical industries will temporarily reduce the burden on Korean pork and pharmaceutical industries. So due to the FTA compared to original version.
Yes, so there are quite a lot of changes made during the additional round of negotiations. So I'd like to discuss about some responses about the outcomes of the additional round of negotiations from Korea and U.S. As far as I know, there are already voices of dissent in both South Korea and United States. In automobile industry, some Koreans are saying that we made too much concessions, and while in pork and the pharmaceutical industries, we gained some concessions from the U.S. side. But so I'd like to ask you that how do you evaluate the overall effect of the additional round of negotiations for Korea-US FTA? Professor Lee, please.
Yes. First of all, excuse me. First of all, we have to remind ourselves that the original version of the Korea-US FTA was a very comprehensive agreement. It ranged from agriculture to the manufacturing and also to the service industry as well. That's one of the most comprehensive and most successful FTA that has been ever been agreed among large industrialized countries. So even though we had additional agreements in those three areas of automobile, agriculture, and pharmaceutical, those three areas are relatively small additional agreement compared to the original versions.
Oh, really? Yes, yes.
So we have to analyze these relatively small additional agreements' impact on the general welfare of Korea and the U.S. And having said that, I can tell you that this additional effect, this marginal effect out of this additional agreement would be very limited. And most of them are short-lived. In the case of automobile, for example, the duties on automobile import was supposed to be eliminated almost immediately, according to the first version. However, according to this additional version, the duty will be phased out in 4 years. It means that the benefit of this free trade in automobile will be delayed by 4 years. But still, the benefit is there. We simply postpone the benefit for 4 years. In the long-term perspective, that postponement is not such a big deal to the automobile industry. That's why the Korean automobile industry actually welcomed this additional agreement as well. So if you emphasize the voices from the opposition parties, they say that we made a concession too much without getting additional benefits. If you look at the additional benefit in the short term, that kind of makes sense. The concessions we made in automobile industry will be relatively larger than the benefits, than the additional benefits that we can expect from the agriculture and pharmaceutical industry. That's true, but as I mentioned, in 4 years, all of those additional concessions will be disappeared. And we have to keep in mind that the first version of the FTA, 2007 FTA, was negotiated under the previous regime where the current opposition party was in power.
Yes.
So actually denying this FTA, Korean-US FTA, even though it is slightly modified, denying it today is kind of self-contradictory to this opposition party that is opposing the additional agreement. And if you look at the voices of the party that support this additional agreement, says that even though we made additional concessions, still it is relatively small. And if you look at the big picture, most of the contents that we made in the original version of 2007 are still there. So we can expect positive effects out of the Korea-US FTA in the long run. And another thing is that the original version, the 2007 version, was successful, particularly to the Korean side.
I see.
Both Korea and the U.S. experts agreed that the 2007 agreement was more favorable to Korea than to U.S., especially to the Korean manufacturing industry. So if we can keep the big picture, the big framework of the 2007 agreement, I still think that it is very much favorable to Korea. The only regret is that we had to do this additional negotiation in 2010. This can be a bad track record for any FTA that we have to make in the future. Having agreed once and then, due to political reasons, do the additional agreement again. That can be a bad precedent.
Well, we'll discuss about that point later. But so, as far as I understand, Professor Lee very positively evaluate outcomes of the additional the negotiations for Korea-US FTA. How about you, Dr. Song?
I almost agree with Professor Lee because you could evaluate the overall effect of this additional agreement such that U.S. will benefit from revising the automobile section and Korea will benefit from the revising the pork and pharmaceutical section. But I think it is wrong because FTA, free trade agreement, the interest of free trade agreement is in free trade. So this additional agreement is different from the original version because it retreats from the trade liberalization or free trade. And so that makes both countries lose. That's the part of I feel sorry about that. But But this FTA is better than no FTA.
Yes. Something is better than nothing,
something is
right?
better than nothing. So anyway, the new agreement would be much better than no FTA, and some people said that Korea did give its auto market to U.S. from this additional agreement. I think it is quite incorrect because even though tariff elimination schedule is delayed, it will be eliminated anyway, and then Korean automakers will access to the U.S. market more easily eventually. And automakers and makers of auto parts will enjoy benefits greatly from the KORUS FTA. But consumer surplus, the more surplus to the consumers will be delayed until 4 years or 5 years, but it will be eliminated anyway. So I think that immediate trade liberalization in the automobile sector and beef market will not be achieved from this agreement, but this is not good for both countries. Okay, so especially not good for the consumers for both countries. But anyway, it will be eliminated, and then both countries will benefit from this new agreement.
I see. Well, Dr. Sung is also, he does also evaluate quite positively about the outcomes of the additional round of negotiations.
Well,
well,
let me,
yes,
if I may
please.
add, I think there is some wrong perception among the general public.
I see.
That having additional agreement can cause some damage to Korea's national economic welfare.
Yes, yes.
However, it's not exactly a damage. As I mentioned, it's simply a postponement of expected benefits over 4 years. So, by postponing the benefits over 4 years, it's not going to add additional damage to the Korean economy. It is simply a delay of the benefits.
Yes, let's talk about another very important issue in the relationship between Korea and the United States, that is the trade of beef. Actually, because of this issue, Korean government had quite a difficult time. And then even just after conclusion of the additional round of negotiations, somebody said that it is possible that the U.S. could ask for even for the concessions on beefs. Well, as far as I know, that the trade of import of the U.S. beefs was not on the agenda of negotiations for Korea-U.S. FTA. Is it true, or Dr. Song?
I think it has nothing to do with FTA, but I think it is possible that U.S. might ask for more liberalization of Korean beef market because after both sides reached the deal, President Obama and the USTR representative Ron Kirk mentioned they will try to fully liberalize the Korean market to the U.S. beef. But Korea is very adamant in its position not to allow import of beef from cattle over 30 months.
Yes, right.
Okay, but the key person in the U.S. Senate, Senator Max Baucus, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, has threatened not to move the FTA unless Korea allows imports of all kinds of beef. Okay, so but he's from Montana. It is included in the beef belt, and then Montana is the biggest source of beef from older cattle.
I see.
So because but the Baucus has reserved his judgment on this additional agreement, but saying he was deeply disappointed that the deal fails to address Korea's barriers to American beef exports. So for the ratification of the FTA in the U.S. Congress, the cooperation from the key people such as Senator Baucus will be needed. So if the political pressure for the full liberalization of Korean market to the U.S. beef from the senators and congressmen is growing, I think it is possible that the U.S. could ask for more liberalization of beef market before finalizing the ratification process. But I think the Korean government is very tough on that issue, so it's not easy to compromise.
You, Dr. Song, mentioned about rectification. I think that is another very important the procedure for us. I mean, to see the effectuation of this FTA. How do you view the prospects for the rectification and of the Korea-U.S. FTA? Well, Professor Lee?
As Dr. Song already mentioned about the political atmosphere of the U.S., let me continue with the U.S. story first. First of all, this additional agreement was kind of initiated and supported by President Barack Obama. He failed to reach a conclusion at the G20 summit in November, and that's why this additional agreement was started. And with the conclusion of this additional agreement, President Barack Obama openly supported this additional agreement. Especially, we have to remind ourselves that one of the reasons he opposed the original version of the agreement was because of the opposition from the U.S. labor union in the automobile industry. And then, this time, the U.S. auto industry is welcoming this additional agreement.
Right.
It means that President Obama has no solid reason to oppose this additional agreement this time. So we expect a full support from the U.S. President. And then, if you look at the U.S. House, now the U.S. House is dominated by the Republicans.
You mean Congress, right?
U.S. Congress.
Yes.
So U.S. Congress will be largely dominated by the Republicans, who are usually more supporting free trade deals. So we expect a relatively easy ratification in the U.S. Congress, which will be supported by the President. But once it moves on to the Senate, then we have some U.S. politicians who are opposing this version. However, at that time, it is the leadership of the President Barack Obama which will push forward. And the timing is so critical in the U.S., We expect that this ratification will take place, if it takes place, in spring next year.
Yeah.
And then we have to make it through next year spring. Otherwise,
Yes.
from the maybe as early as May 2011, the U.S. presidential campaign will start.
Yes.
And then U.S. politicians will lose their mind out of this FTA deal.
I
So
see.
there will be only one big chance that we can go through this ratification in the U.S. Next spring.
Okay, I think that's a very important point. I mean, well, the presidential election in the USA certainly will be a very important factor affecting the rectification of Korea-US FTA.
Sure.
Well, because time is very limited, so I'd like to ask the last question to you. Well, somebody is concerned about the so-called negative spillover effects of the Korea-US FTA on Korea-EU FTA, right? Because that, as we mentioned before, we had the additional round of negotiations for Korea-US FTA. We are right now waiting for the rectification of Korea-EU FTA. Maybe if the EU does not satisfy with something, I mean, the contents of the Korea-EU FTA, maybe they can ask the additional negotiation. What do you think about this?
I think the possibility is very rare. According to the Korea-EU FTA, if Korea provides more favor to the other country than to European Union when the FTA between Korea and other country is signed after the Korea-EU FTA takes effect, then Korea has to provide the same favor to European Union. So European Union should be treated as the most favored nation. But the Korea-EU FTA is not enforced yet. So this provision cannot be applied right now. But in this additional negotiation with U.S., Korea promised to relax its environmental regulations, such as the regulation on greenhouse gas emissions and fuel economy to the imported U.S. cars. So it is not included in the free trade agreement. European Union might ask for the same treatment to the imported European cars. It has nothing to do with FTA. But anyway, this might have been the result of additional negotiation with U.S. For cross FTA. So European Union might ask for the relaxation of the environmental regulation to the imported European Union's car.
Well, thank you very much. And we discussed about the details of the additional round of negotiations for Korea-US FTA. Well, I think the Korea-US FTA is expected to increase the Korean GDP by 6% and add $10 billion to the U.S. GDP. And so let's hope the mutually beneficial agreement take effect soon to bring the Korea and U.S. economy closer together. Well, thank you very much, Professor Lee and Dr. Song, for sharing your opinion with us today. And this has been Shin Sang-hyo for InFocus, and thank you for watching this program.